Ready. Hi, everyone. Happy whatever day it is. Hope you are all doing really well. I'm very excited to kick off the webinar. So let's first start with some housekeeping, and then we'll move into introducing the panelists, which is me and Paul Gennaro. So thank you for joining us today for this Disabilities in the Workplace, Culture, Communication, Support, and Inclusion. The presentation is based on a study that IPR and Voya Financial are partnering on that will be released next week, which we're very excited about. So I know you all have done hopefully other webinars with IPR, and there really is no difference to what we're doing with this one in terms of housekeeping. But we definitely encourage you to participate as much as you can. You can post questions in the Q&A. Please give your comments, feedback, anything you want, share research articles in the chat. This webinar is being recorded, and we will make it available for playback after this webinar. And we will also share any resources that may be shared as well. If you have any issues whatsoever, you can send a message to one of our IPR staff members, or I should call them our team members. There's Sarah and Brittany who can help you. And then I hope you enjoyed today's webinar and look for our study next week. Did I miss anything, folks?
We usually just say if you want to share what city you're joining from in the chat just to get us kicked off, that'd be fun and great too.
Yes, and feel free if you want to converse about whatever in the chat, please feel free to do so. Okay. So I am very happy to introduce, and then Paul, you can say something about yourself so I don't have to, even though I know what you do. But I'm very happy today to talk about disabilities in the workplace in our new study with Voya Financial. And I'm very excited to be joined by our IPR trustee, the SVP of Brand and Corporate Comms, and Chief Communications Officer of Voya Financial. One thing before I turn it over to Paul to introduce himself is that when you think about organizations and what they're doing and the work in this space, Voya is at the top. They really live and breathe the importance of making sure that people with disabilities and their caregivers are included in the workspace. So Paul, do you want to give like a 2-sentence intro about yourself?
Certainly. Thanks so much, Tina. So as Tina mentioned, I'm the Chief Brand and Communications Officer for Voya Financial. I also, on the nonprofit side, sit on the board of an organization called Disability In. You can see the logo here. So Disability In's mission is to drive greater employment for people with disabilities and special needs. We're excited. I'm excited, both wearing my Voya hat as well as the Disability In hat, for what we're going to go through today. Because what we've experienced at Voya is that by including people with disabilities and special needs in our branding, communications, and marketing efforts and activities, they just become more effective. And they resonate more strongly internally with our employees, externally with all audiences. And candidly, we're kind of surprised that more organizations aren't doing this. So we're excited to hear about the results of the research and to share our perspective. Back to you, Tina.
Thank you very much, Paul. All right, let's go ahead and kick it off. Okay, so before we dive into our study itself, I just wanted to give a brief background of some of the work that we've done in this space. So a couple of years ago, or a year and a half ago, we released a study that we did with the Wakeman Agency, focused on the language of diversity. And one of the questions that we asked was about the priority of diversity initiatives within organizations. And what you can see is that we asked about several aspects of disability, physical abilities and disability, neurodiversity, and then mental health. And as you can, if you can't see it, I'll describe it, that in the middle is mental health. About 34% said mental health was a priority. Approximately 24% said physical abilities and disabilities were a priority. And then 14% said that neurodiversity, which we defined as ADHD and autism spectrum, were a high priority for organizations. But most of the individuals with those areas said that they were low priority. And I know that there's a lot of different types of diversity, but disabilities are really important. So when we saw this, we knew that we had to talk more about people with disabilities in the workplace and how we can best support them. Oh, I didn't click the slide. I'm so terrible at clicking slides. My apologies. So now I have put on the slide that has the I'll let you take a glance, but for those who may not be able to see it, the numbers remain the same. All right, so let's get to disabilities in the workplace. And here's what the research says, and this is important, is that 2/3 of disabilities are invisible. So unless someone self-discloses that they have a disability, or if it's visible, then you can't necessarily see in someone's exterior. So that's why it's really critically important for us to understand how to help with either accommodations if they are needed, but also making sure that people with disabilities feel included in the workplace. One of the other important considerations is that there are many caregivers of people with disabilities who also may need additional flexibility. But in this research that the US Bureau of Labor Statistics published, is that 2/3 of workplace leaders believe their tech arrangements are supportive, but there's a gap because those with disabilities only half agree that that is the case. So there definitely is some work to be done to make sure that the technology, and that could be like the visuals or anything with audio, or even just the setup, that it's also easier to navigate. For us at IPR, we have an accessible website. So what does that mean? And how does that help people who may be neurodiverse or colorblind or epileptic? So those are all important considerations. And then here's what we have also seen, and this was Samsung UK research that was done last year. And we've already talked about the need for tech to make sure that there's accommodation. But there's also a need for more education that 1/3 of respondents in the survey said around people with disabilities. And then some believe that 43% of people with disabilities, which means 4 out of 10, that they've avoided sharing their disability because they believe it may affect the workplace. And spoiler alert, we also saw similar findings in our study. And then 2 more slides and then we'll get into it. But I wanted to just talk about the scope of disabilities and how around the world. Now, this is from Accessible by Design. This was a publication that Current Global PRCA out of the UK and PR Council, they published a great report that gives accessibility guidelines. It was called Accessible by Design. And these are some of the statistics that they said. For example, 300 million people around the world are visually impaired. 200 million have a cognitive disability, and people with disabilities make up 15% of the world's population. And what I will also say about disabilities is one area of the diversity spectrum that can affect anybody at any time. So you may have a temporary disability, you may have a permanent disability that you may get at some point in your life, or you may be a caregiver of someone with a disability. And then the last before we get into it is I thought this slide was very important because it shows the frustration that can happen when people with disabilities may encounter some sort of hindrance with some of the content that they are consuming. So for example, it says 64% of those who have an assisted tool have reported having problems consuming content, right? Which is very important for brands to know. And inaccessible communications leads to emotions such as frustration, being disappointed, that you feel ignored or unhappy or isolated. But when brands are accessible, there's a lot of great positive outcomes. Like there's higher feelings of satisfaction, support, happiness, inclusion. Because, we talk a lot about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, but making sure that we're supporting people with disabilities goes to that eye that we are making people feel and experience inclusion and belonging in the workplace. Okay, so here's the great study that we did, not to brag, but it's really great. And I want to thank Paul and the Voya team. I mean, this would not have happened without their support and just their thought leadership in this. So they've been wonderful partners. So this was a survey that we did in January of this year of 1,014 employees at organizations with 15 or more employees. And we wanted to find out how workplaces and organizations support people with disabilities and caregiving in the workplace. Before we administered the survey, we gave definitions on what a disability is and also on what caregiving is. For example, we said that disability is could be physical, like physical ability, sensory impairment, cognitive impairment, intellectual impairment, mental illness. It could be a chronic disease if someone has cancer. And so it ranges from physical, cognitive, emotional, behavioral. I know a lot of us have people, we may have disabilities that are temporary or permanent, or we may be caregivers of those. So what we wanted to do is sort of set what we see in the workplace. And in the survey, what we found is that 65% of people with disabilities have witnessed discrimination in the workplace for reasons other than a disability. But then the second row and the third row talks about macroaggressions and microaggressions. So macroaggressions are those that are very obvious. And we asked people, have you witnessed or experienced, we didn't say the term macroaggressions, but intentional, hostile, derogatory statements or actions toward people with disabilities. And 55% of people with disabilities said they had, and 30% of people without disabilities said they had. Then when we asked about microaggressions, which are more subtle or unintentional statements or behaviors, that number was 59% for people with disabilities and 40% of people without disabilities. And that marker was at least a few times a year. What we found is that people with disabilities, there are approximately 11% who experience macroaggressions and microaggressions every day. Going into the communication piece, this is I felt like this study, or what both Paul and I did, that there's a mix of both information for communicators, but also for HR and culture. So I want to talk a little bit about the communication aspect. So we asked questions about how well does your organization specifically communicate about how to support those with disabilities, and then also about how to support caregivers. And we segmented that by people without disabilities, people with disabilities, and caregivers. So looking at the data, what we see is that 51% of people without disabilities believe that their organization does at least a good job of communicating about how to support those with disabilities. When you get into people with disabilities and caregivers, those numbers actually improve. And that goes for both caregivers and for people with disabilities. So people with disabilities and caregivers believe their organization does a better job of communicating. So this is a really great opportunity for communicators to say, you know, we need to make sure that everyone knows in our organization how we're supporting those with disabilities. Because like I said, you never know when it may impact you personally. And so there's a lot of great room for opportunity and growth there. And then Paul, if there's anything you want to, feel free to jump in and yes. Okay, so then we ask questions specifically about how important is it that organizations are inclusive of people in their communications, advertising, and marketing. And what we see is that 73% said it is at least somewhat important of people without disabilities that you do include people in comms, advertising, and marketing. When you go into, or when you look into people with disabilities as well as caregivers, that number increases higher. So you have 84% of people with disabilities who say, yes, it is critically important. And people want to see people who look like them. We see this, we hear this time and time again in the DE&I literature. And same thing with caregivers. 83% said it is absolutely important that advertising reflects that. But then when we dove into how well is your organization doing, that's when we saw it drop. So then we asked specifically about internal and employee focused communications. And for all the respondents, only 39% said that their organization does feature people with disabilities in employee focused communications. 32% said they saw it in social media, and then 36% said in the commercials and advertisements. So there's a really great opportunity to do that, because if 2/3 of people have disabilities or invisible, it's very important. And then you have people who don't disclose. it's very important that there are reflected in the work that is done. Okay, so then we also wanted to find out about the visibility, and Voya is a great example of a company that leads by example. Their CEO is very passionate. Heather is very passionate about disability in the workplace, and the executive leadership talks about disability and caregiving responsibilities and their personal journeys. So we wanted to find out the same information as well. So we asked people about how well does your organization communicate about their commitment? How well does it publicly celebrate their commitment to supporting individuals? So about 50%, about half or slightly more than half, said that their organization does celebrate its commitment to supporting individuals with disabilities. But as what I think is really important to note, and as a researcher, is if you have 53% who said that they publicly celebrate, you always want to think about there's 47% who say that their organization really doesn't. And one of the other areas of opportunity that we saw throughout this whole study is that we need to do better jobs of talking about caregiving responsibilities in the workplace. So 49% of people said that their organization talks about leadership commitment to supporting caregivers. So there's a lot of opportunity for change here. All right, so let's go into culture and community. So we asked questions about, well, how well the organization creates an inclusive environment for employees with disabilities. And again, this is where we see people without disabilities rating the organizations lower than people with disabilities. Approximately 67% said that their organization does create, people with disabilities said that their organization does create an inclusive environment. So if we have 67%, then that means that 33% said that their organization probably needs additional work. And then we also asked the same for caregivers, and people without disabilities, only 48%, so less than half, said that their organization does create an inclusive environment for caregivers. And then we saw that number similarly dropped slightly from the previous slide, that 62% said that their organization creates an inclusive environment for caregivers. And we also asked the same question of caregivers, and that number was 67%. So caregivers did rate their organization highest. And I'm going to talk in a few minutes about why that is so critically important. So then we just asked general questions. So we talked about how well they communicate. We talked about the overall culture, but then we asked about overall general levels of support of people with disabilities and employees. So people without disabilities said that 63% said their organization was at least somewhat supportive of people with disabilities. And then that number increased for people with disabilities slightly to 69%. And then caregivers was 73%. Now, if you say 69% of people with disabilities say it is inclusive, that means that 31% of people believe that it is probably not as inclusive. And that is definitely an area of work. What was interesting though, and what we don't get here, but is actually a report. This is just a snapshot of the report. It's a very comprehensive report. And, but what we did find is that when you ask then about specific programs, like what about assistive technology? What about financial empowerment, like wealthy? What about hiring, like hiring guidelines or making it a high priority in organizations, we saw those numbers decline. So while people said, yes, they're supportive, but when we looked at sort of best practices, those weren't as well known. Sarah, I just looked up and I saw there are 41 messages in the chat. Is there something, does anyone have like questions that I need to go back for Paul or I yet?
You're totally good.
Good. Everyone's commenting. I love that. Thank you. Please keep that up. I love the engagement. So great. Okay. And then supportive of caregivers of people with disabilities. And then, so we, well, so 50% of people without disabilities said that their organization is supportive of caregivers, and then 59% for people with disabilities. And then caregivers is 66%. And I want to go back and just apologize. Paul and I we try to be very cognizant of this because I've seen Paul present before. But for people who are visually impaired, it's really important that I tell you, I'm trying to be very mindful of making sure I talk about what's on the screen in case you can't see it. But just to sort of for a visual, so I'm the president at IPR, and I have long blonde hair and I have glasses and I have a black shirt on, and I'm actually sitting in my bed because I had ankle surgery 7 weeks ago. So I am actually temporarily disabled as well. So Paul, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself as well. Sorry about that, folks.
Yep, no worries. So I am a white guy with brown hair, 54. So that means my hairline is receding. We're fighting a good fight there. I have a blue disability in. I mentioned I'm on the disability in board. I guess 1/4 zip top on, and I'm in my home office here. I'm sitting down. By the way, Tina on her little cart with her injured ankle I saw her at a conference this week is just incredible.
Thank you. I was wheeling around. I think people were a little jealous of my scooting ability, but I was definitely wheeling around. But I will also tell you last week, there are so many additional challenges with traveling and it was just hard. There were things I couldn't do. So it was definitely tough, but I appreciate that, Paul. Thank you. Okay, so what we also found in the research is that, and this isn't just for people with disabilities and caregivers, this is for a lot of people, how important the employee resource group is in organizations, and also a great sounding board for organizations. That way, you have individuals who are very passionate and making sure that we're inclusive, and also offering a support center for individuals in whatever ERG they may be in. So we asked about whether their organization offers ERGs for caregivers and people with disabilities, and 40%, and we saw this in a lot of areas, but 39% said that there is an employee resource group for people with disabilities, but 32% were unsure. And we also saw that with caregivers. There were lower numbers with caregivers, that 32% said there was indeed a caregiving ERG, and then 38% were unsure. Those percentages jumped some for when we asked if there was training around disability etiquette. And nearly 50% of organizations said that they do disability etiquette programs. And then we also asked questions about, are there opportunities where people can learn more about individuals with disabilities through programs such as Lunch and Learns or workshops, or even just talking about how it fits into D&I or why it's important to support colleagues or supervisor training. There's a lot of opportunities there. So we also asked questions about how interested people are in learning more about disability and inclusion. And there, over 50% of people without disabilities were interested in learning. So there's also a lot of great opportunities for comms people or HR functions to make sure that that's reflected in their professional development and curriculum. And even 72% of people with disabilities were very interested in learning more about disability and inclusion, or about disability inclusion. And that number was also very similar for caregivers at 74%. So yes. And then I'm almost done. I'm going to turn it over to Paul. But before I do, we asked specific questions about people with disabilities and caregivers. So we asked people if they have a disability. We asked people if they had a disability, and 18% of our respondents, so nearly 200, said that they did have a disability. And that number was 241 out of 1,014 respondents who said they were caregivers for people with disabilities. And that is very reflective of what we see in the literature as well. So we asked whether people had disclosed their disability to their employer. 80% said they had, 20% had not. We had an open-ended question that asked people, if you have not, why not? And I wish I could say that the reason why they had it was primarily because it didn't make a difference, but the majority of reasons were actually very negative, that they believe that there would be stigma, there would be ridicule, that they may lose hours, that they have potential for reduced hours, that they thought it would affect their promotion opportunities. So that was very real with our sample as well. And then for caregivers, 68% said they had, but a large chunk had not. And why that's really important is because if you're at an organization that offers support services and you're very closely aligned with your supervisor and colleagues, having, and if you need accommodation or it affects, it's such a win-win for organizations because it helps productivity, it helps satisfaction, and it helps people's sense of being connected to the organization. And then we asked about if people have left a job. And this, I think, was upsetting to see, both that people with half of the people with disabilities have left a job due to a disability. And then nearly like 2/3 has said they had left a job because of their caregiving responsibilities. So those are pretty significant numbers. And that also goes with inclusion. And I'll tell you, both my parents are deceased, but my mom, and I never talk about this, as my team can probably tell you, but I'll try, I'm not going to cry. I was a professor at a university and I found out my mom had a terminal illness and she had less than a month to live. And I had to talk to my employer. I had all these responsibilities. And my supervisor was like, you just go and do what you need to do. And I just left. Like I was supposed to teach a new class and I was able to go home and like be with my mom before she died. And that was only like a week when she actually still could communicate and verbalize. And it was just really challenging just to like fully focus on taking care of her, but also to be able to, grieve the inevitable loss. And I wouldn't have been in a good place for my job. And if you think about people who don't have that opportunity and sort of like, what are we doing here on this planet? And putting yourself, like having empathy for people who are in that situation, it's so critically important that people have that opportunity to take care of people who may be disabled, because we're all going to get older someday, or we may all have a disability, or something may happen, God forbid, that we have to help. And I mean, cancer, heart disease, there's so many things that can affect people. So I think employers making sure that they're talking about it and also making sure that they're providing an environment to help people when they have that circumstance. All right. And then just people with disabilities, we asked about, are they providing you what you need to be successful with your job? And we saw that for about 2/3 of respondents said they pretty much are. What was one of the other areas is that fully remote and hybrid employees scored their organization significantly higher on all metrics than fully in-person employees. So that flexibility piece is really important for people, especially when they need it. And then we also ask questions, and this is my last slide, and then turn it over to Paul, is that the caregivers of people with disabilities, and we see this, and this isn't surprising, that people with caregiving responsibilities are more comfortable talking about it than people with disabilities. And if we saw from before that the stigma, the ridicule, those are all reasons why people may have challenge, they feel like it could affect them personally. So that makes sense. But then when you have like 62% said that my organization provides benefits and resources, 63% say that they have the flexibility to manage caregiving responsibilities. We see that flipped, that means that 37% of people say that I don't get the flexibility with their caregiving responsibilities. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Paul to talk about some of the work they're doing at Voya and some of the additional research that they did. But I just want to thank Paul for giving us the opportunity, because I think this is such an important sort of neglected area of research and discussion that we have in our industry. So thank you, Paul, and Voya and your team. Your team's fantastic.
Thanks, Tina. Can you hear me? If you can, give me a thumbs up. All right, awesome. As tends to happen, this gets scheduled weeks in advance, and the landscape guys show up at exactly this time. So I'm going to pick up my voice as to the extent that they get close by. First off, I want to again thank IPR for the incredible research and the work and the time and care that they put into this. I'm going to talk for just a couple minutes. I'll share a couple of things with you all. When I do want to start by saying we approach this, Voya does, from a very humble and grateful position, because this is not something from a brand communications marketing standpoint where we said this is what we're going to do when we started to take active efforts in this area back in 2017. It was a CEO at the time and a business leader who's now our CEO, Heather Lavallee, who said, we want to make this important for Voya as far as serving customers and clients, as far as serving our employees, and that's inclusivity of people with disabilities and special needs. So then based on that, we started to build that into what we did. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And we saw some results that were really incredible from an engagement standpoint, from a response standpoint. And from there, we started to build on that. So a couple things. Tina mentioned it with the numbers. And I'll just start with the header here. We have a societal problem to solve. So this is a problem. The good news, oftentimes we have problems and we don't have solutions. We have solutions, particularly the folks that would be tuned in to a webinar like this. But let's look in the top left of this box. So folks that can't see it, 27%, so about 1 in 4 Americans, adults in the US have a disability of some sort. If you want to take that outside of the US globally, the numbers are pretty much aligned. As Tina mentioned, 1 in 5 individuals are a caregiver or will find themselves in a caregiver role at some point in their lifetime. So that is a huge number when you think about the scale of this. When you talk about marginalized communities, I think this is pretty much the largest. And then on top of that, if you look at the top right, this is a marginalized community that's made up largely of other marginalized communities. So there's an intersection there that's just huge. However, for some reason, this is a marginalized community, people with disabilities and caregivers, that does not get the requisite attention. It's not good for society. It's not good for any of us. And there's an opportunity here for society to do better. And that's where I think folks that would be tuned into this, your branding, marketing, communications individuals, HR individuals, leaders that have tuned in, whether it's in a corporate setting or in a municipal setting, in a school setting, an opportunity to really to drive change. One of the things that change looks like, and I mentioned I'm on the board of Disability In, really pertains to employment. So on the bottom left of this slide, what you see is my CEO, Heather Lavallee, and she's in the center of this slide wearing a black and white jacket. And she is flanked by 3 individuals on her right, 2 individuals on her left that are college students from Disability In. So these are college students or recent graduates who happen to have disabilities that are part of their mentor program. Now, as Heather shared with these individuals when she met with them for a Job Shadow the CEO event we had last month, she said, I'm so impressed by you all because I read your resumes and your bios, but I also know the disabilities that you have and the challenges and the perseverance and what you overcome each day. And the fact that it's more challenging for you to find a job than someone without a disability is an injustice and something we need to do something about. So if you go to the bottom right of this slide, you see 2 terms there. Now, when we talk about jobs and employment, everybody tends to go to the unemployment numbers. And you can see those there. For folks without a disability, we've seen in business news, we're near historic lows for unemployment. So about 3% of the population without disabilities would be classified as unemployed. And then people with disabilities, it's about 8%. Now, at first glance, you'd look at that and say, well, it's a 5% difference, roughly 3 times as many. That's not good. It's something we need to address. That's not what you need to look at. What you need to look at is the numbers below that, which are labor force participation. When you look at those numbers, you see that people without disabilities participate in the workforce, about 68% of that population. With disabilities, it's about 24%. So let's flip it around. About 76% of people with disabilities are not participating in the workforce. That is incredibly troubling. What that means, I think, my take on this, employers across the country haven't embraced their responsibility to make their jobs fully accessible. And I think folks that are in the disability community, I've heard this from individuals, I've heard this from caregivers, they're almost conditioned, don't go seek employment. It's not an option. For too many, that's the way it's looked at. And that's really an opportunity that we have to drive change. So I talk about the problem. It is a societal problem. What we're talking about here today, I think, and Tina's research certainly sets up the discussion, is what we can do with the roles that we have. So next slide, please. So question then you would ask is, all right, is any of this new, Paul? Why now, right? We always talk about the timeliness and we're talking about news. There's momentum here and the momentum is growing. In this slide, I'm going to point to 4 data points that back up my answer to why now, why we need to act, particularly the folks that are tuned into this. So on the Disability In board, one of the things I suggested back in 2019, I said, you know what, if we got CEOs involved signing on to drive greater inclusivity of people with disabilities and special needs, that would be a good thing. So we started out with a letter in January of 2020, and there were 6 CEOs that signed the letter. It was Accenture, it was CVS Health, it was Intel, Microsoft, Walmart, and Voya Financial. So Voya CEO and 5 other ones sent a letter out to the Fortune 1000. Now they did this in January of 2020. We started with 6. As you all are quite well aware, 2020, there was a lot going on. And in 2021, I would love to tell you there was a really synchronized, focused effort to get that number from 6 to where we are today, 164. And there certainly was some good work done on the part of the disability and staff. But largely what's happened is organically, CEOs have said to their head of inclusion or their head of accessibility or their head of HR or disability, and they just reach out and said, hey, I want to sign on to this letter, encouraging the rest of the CEOs in the Fortune 1000 to participate in this. So if your CEO is not one of these 164, the data would suggest and the momentum would suggest that they're going to be. If you look at the top right, so I mentioned CEOs are focused on this, a lot of momentum there. Look at the top right. Now we're talking about investors. So when I talk about investors, and you see the number circled there, $2.8 trillion in investable assets. These are investors that have said, we are going to consider whether a company that we invest in is inclusive of people with disabilities. And if it's not participating in the Disability Equality Index, which is kind of the best places to work for disabilities, if they're not doing that, we may not invest in them. Now, who are those investors? It's Voya Financial, but it's Bank of America. It's state comptrollers like the state comptroller for New York that has the second highest amount of investable assets out there in pension funds. So your investors are focused on it. If you go to the bottom left, you see the Disability Inclusion Advantage. This is a research report that you can find online, or you can email me, paul.gennaro@voya.com. I will send it to you, that Accenture put out in 2018. And this looks at business metrics. And what this report tells you is pick your metric, return on investment, total shareholder return, employee engagement, whatever you want. Accenture measured it, and organizations that are more inclusive of people with disabilities outperformed ones that do not. So that's the third point. On the fourth point, over the bottom right of this, so Tina's research, we look to complement that. We asked the folks at Morning Consult, so a world-leading research firm that Voya partners with to measure our own brand awareness and growth and our attributes and where are we at. We asked them to ask 3 questions, and they asked about 2,000 individuals back in April. And the 3 questions were, I have a more favorable impression, I'm not going to read the whole question, of companies that are actively, visibly inclusive of people with disabilities in their advertising, communications, and marketing. So I have a more favorable impression. Agree and strongly agree, 84%. I want to do business with these companies. Agree and strongly agree, 80%. I trust these companies more. Agree and strongly agree, 75%. So I shared the problem in the previous slide. I'm sharing the why now here. So just to recap, why now? Because your CEO is going to think this is important if they haven't already signed the letter. If the CEO isn't good enough for you, well, what about your investors? If you're a publicly traded company, they're telling you. The Accenture report says your company will perform better. And then if you're on this call, you're probably involved in branding, communications, and marketing. Consumers and stakeholders are saying, this is what we want to see. Folks, this is the answers to the test right here. So the why now, it is right here. Go over to the next slide. So this speaks to the solution. So Tina and I were at a conference earlier this week. Jamie Dimon was one of the speakers. And what he talked about people that present problems and they almost admire the problem, right? And we see that so often, whether it's in politics and business, people talk about these complex problems. They admire it. It's so, look at this, it's incredible. Well, we have an opportunity to address it. Here's the solution for what we do in branding and communications and marketing and our HR colleagues that are on board and folks that are driving organizations to perform better. Tina's research pointed to the need, right? So we talk about internally. So on this slide, on the top right, this is a group of Voya leaders that during a leadership meeting took time out to build wheelchairs for individuals that needed wheelchairs to make them available to them. Why? Because it's part of our culture and it's driving engagement. And there's things that you can do internally to reinforce that as part of your culture. It's going to drive engagement. It's going to drive retention. We've seen it in our numbers, and I'm happy to talk about it. If you look at the top left of this slide and the bottom right, you see screen grabs from 2 of our recent commercials. Top left is 2 years ago, our growing up spot. which at the time was our best performing TV commercial that we had ever had. And the brand's just celebrating our 10-year anniversary. The bottom right is our TV commercial, one of the ones that's in market right now called Diner. And that is performing better than any one that we've ever had before. I will also tell you, I just got a text from Jim Calsert, our head of advertising this morning. Right now, we're doing focus groups talking about our creative we're going to launch in January. So as we're sharing different concepts with them, our concepts include people with disabilities, but we weren't asking them, what do you think of that? What we got unsolicited feedback last night, and I'm going to join them this evening, unsolicited feedback from consumers, they like that. We're not even asking them, and they're telling us that. And then the bottom left there is from our social campaign in 2017, which really started all this for us. And the little girl there, Lily from Colorado. So we partnered with Special Olympics on a 1-week social campaign. Our goal was to get 500,000 engagements. So likes or shares or comments, 500,000 in 1 week. That was our goal. And that was an aggressive goal for us. We didn't get 500,000 in 1 week. Our first time partnering on a social program focused on special needs and people with disabilities. We didn't get 500,000. We got 940,000, almost 1 million engagements in 1 week. The campaign ended up being a finalist for ESPN Sports Humanitarian Award. I mentioned we did it with Special Olympics. So that was an eye opener for us. Maybe we should do more in this space. And again, this speaks to this audience that we've got on here. I'm just going to touch on one more thing briefly, and then I'd love to go to your questions. So if we can go to the next slide. So this slide features an individual that I got to meet through Disability Inn, Andrew Hoyt. Andrew was one of the college students like the ones that met with Heather last month. And Andrew was my mentee in 2017. So it was a one-year mentorship, but we continue to stay in touch since that time. So March 18th of this year, I got an email from Andrew's account, but it wasn't from Andrew, it was from his mom. Andrew had passed away on March 18th. He had a seizure. So I thought back to the last conversation I had with Andrew, which was about 2 weeks prior. And I said, Paul, what do I do? And we were talking about jobs. He had interned with Voya, by the way. This kid is brilliant. The picture on the right is at the stock exchange. This kid is brilliant. He interned with our asset management business, and they extended the internship because of what a great job he did. He said to me, what do I do? I applied for this job that I really wanted, and they offered me the job, and I accepted it. The next day, I was talking to them, and I shared with them what my accessibility needs were. He said an hour later, they called me back and said, oh, the job has changed. We're going to have to rescind the offer. That's criminal, right? And we talked about it. What can you do? And that's a whole nother conversation. But that's the world we live in right now, right? So when we talk about the solutions that we can provide, that we can help make, because we wear these branding, communications, and marketing hats, there's a sense of urgency that should be there because this is about real people. Last thing I'll say on employment, Ted Kennedy Jr., very involved in Disability Inn, the American Association of People with Disabilities. He talks about, and he has a prosthetic leg, he talks about when you give someone a job, you give them freedom. So there is a sense of urgency that we should all share, that we should drive here. I said last thing, this is really the last thing, Tina, and then I'll go to Q&A. What I would say is talking to folks that I talk with that wear hats like I wear, I think every person that I ask right now in 2023, if I ask the question, are your branding, marketing, and communication efforts and activities, the things, your commercials, what you put out there, are they inclusive? Every person is going to say yes, and they're going to believe it because these are good, smart people. But then I ask them, are your advertising and communications and marketing efforts, do they show people with disabilities? Most of them, and Tina's research and there are other research out there will back it up, are going to have to say no if they answer honestly. So they're not really inclusive. And it's not out of malice, but now we know, now everyone knows, and we're going to work with IPR to raise this conversation and get this message out there and hopefully drive that. So with that, back to you, Tina. I'm sorry, you're muted, Tina.
I got it. There we go. Thank you so much, Paul. That was great. And I appreciate you sharing the story about Andrew. Okay. Now I can see the chat. Oh, look, someone from Bellingham. That's right down the street from me. I love that place. Okay, sorry. Okay, look at all okay. Sarah, you may have to just direct me to the first question.
The first question is from Vilma. She said, are there any statistics of disabled people in the beauty industry being in the marketing, advertisement, or communication department? So
I'm not sure. Paul, do you know of any?
I don't have any stats. Is it possible to bring a slide back up?
Yes. I mean,
So this is
Let's-
unscripted. If you can bring it back up,
sure.
it's my second slide. I'm sorry, no, it's the third slide that has the commercials. So if you look at the top right, the woman in the bottom left with the blonde hair is my colleague, Karen Eisenbach. Karen passed away about 2 weeks ago, unexpectedly. Karen volunteered her time for an organization called Creative Spirit. So if you don't know about it, I encourage you to check it out, Creative Spirit. They are a volunteer, a nonprofit organization that places people that have skills in branding, communications, and marketing with full-time jobs and with job opportunities. So please check out Creative Spirit. I did just want to give a shout out to Karen, who was an incredible and inspiring individual. That said, I don't have an answer to that question as far as the data, but what I would say, if you simply do the math and extrapolate, I've got a team of about 40 folks. There are folks on that team certainly that have disabilities of some sort. Some of them may not disclose it, but they're there.
And there's another question from Jen. He asked if.
Oh, I see this one. Are there any statistics?
Yes.
Okay, so Paul, are there any statistics around people with disabilities who were rejected for their job applications and later did not feel they were seen and did not apply further to any jobs? This is a missed conversation because a lot checked out during the pandemic in particular. Sometimes it is an HR issue where they screen folks out rather than in.
So I will tell you, I don't have statistics, but I certainly, the question is based in fact. So I showed you the picture earlier of Heather and the 5 disability in students. One of the students was a gentleman named Krishna. Krishna graduated a few years ago. He is brilliant. And when I say brilliant, he asked questions of Heather because he poured through our financials. By the way, he happens to be blind. So pouring through our financials was not easy for him, but he did. And he asked her questions that Heather said, these are the challenging questions that I get from investors during investor roadshows. So here's a brilliant individual. What he shared during the meeting was he's thinking about giving up on finding an analyst role because it's been that difficult. So I don't have stats, but I know they're real and they're out there.
Okay. Going to the. Are there any more questions?
Oh, the Q&A.
The Q&A just said Paul, I think. Oh, is there a question? Okay.
There's-
Okay. Paul, I'm the leader of a new employee resource group at my company with a fresh slate. How can we advance disability inclusion across an organization as the leader of a cross-company ERG?
So I would say learn from others. So if we go back to Voya in September of 2015, where Ron, our CEO at the time, and Heather volunteered to lead the effort. When we started down the road, we knew nothing. Okay, we knew nothing about adequately serving the disability community internally or externally. So we did a couple of things. One, first off, from a reputation standpoint, I said, we cannot get this wrong. Of all the things you could try to do, this is one thing you do not want to get wrong. So we reached out to folks like the National Down Syndrome Society. That was incredibly helpful. Easter Seals is incredibly helpful. Disability In, I'm not plugging them, they're incredibly helpful. So we reached out to these organizations and said, what can we learn? How can we do this better? We did employee focus groups within our organization. We simply put in our internal newsletter, we want to focus on disability inclusion. We'd like to hear from our employees about what we should be focused on and how to go about this. The response rate was overwhelming. We got oversubscribed immediately. It was almost like selling Taylor Swift tickets as far as the people that wanted to be part of the conversation. And as Tina's data pointed to, a lot of times they're people that are directly impacted. They have a disability or a caregiver, or it's in the family, but more often than not, they're not. They just care and they want to help. So we saw that firsthand. I will mention Disability In. Again, go on their website. We have a conference coming up in July in Orlando. Last year in Houston, 2,000 people in person, another 2,000 people participated virtually. And this is all about learning from this. And if you want to make it real simple, look at some of the organizations that are out there. If you just simply reach out to their head of their council or their engagement group or their ERG, people are happy to share information on this. And then last but not least, call me, email me. I will help you any way I can.
Awesome. And Beth had a question. Is there a report or website that you would recommend that speaks to the best practices for ensuring your comms are inclusive? And we did share accessible
By design. Yeah, I saw Rebecca was on here. Shout out to Rebecca at Current Global for all their work. I will say there's actually I don't know of any specifics in like comms, but we do know that you have to be very mindful of different types of disabilities. So if it's neurodiversity, if someone's colorblind, if someone's epileptic, there's a lot of different considerations that you have to think about. For example, on our website, what we have at IPR, which wasn't that expensive. I mean, it's not terribly expensive. It's a little bit expensive, a plugin, but if you go to our website, there's a little person in the corner and you can click on it and it will make the website more accessible. Because if you can't have stuff like flashing, or if someone like both of my sons are red, green colorblind, so they can't see some things. And so you have to make sure that if people are visually impaired or if they have auditory issues, you have to make sure. And it's also what we also do at IPR, and Sarah and the team are really great with this, is making sure that you have that you have text, that if you have like alt text, so if you put a photo up on Instagram, that you're using alt text to describe it. When we send out graphics or like a graphic e-blast, we make sure we have the text below. So it's those of being mindful, and there's a lot to point out in the accessible by design, but it's just thinking of all these different areas. And we're happy to share whatever you want, like our team and the resources that we have, because it is really important. But the accessible by design, that piece, it really is pretty comprehensive. I don't know, Paul, if you have anything to add.
No, I would echo everything that you said. I would say for anyone who's new to this and starting out the journey, there is a lot that we had to do to get up to speed during the last 6-7 years of things that we just didn't do. So we put out employee videos. We didn't have closed captioning. It was just not something that we did, but we do now. We didn't share transcripts of what the CEO is saying on the video. We do now. Things with our website, as Tina said, there's so many things. And what at least we found is when people bring things to our attention, first thing we say is we're sorry. And almost always when we say we're sorry, they say that's okay, because they appreciate the effort. So we're sorry, but we're going to fix it. And we've looked to do that. But there's a lot to do.
And then I just try to be, I like, even for this webinar, we had the closed caption activated, but it's also us learning. Paul and I didn't describe ourselves at the beginning, and it just dawned on me. So just also realizing that we made mistakes, and we learn a lot from people who contact us telling us what we need to do better. So please, we're very open. I think everyone wants to do what's right by their employees, their audiences. So absolutely.
Yeah, I would say even when it comes to the casting for TV commercials, when we first started discussing it, there was, okay, and I forget who said it, but they said, are we going to be able to find the talent that happens to have a disability? And we said as a group, we're going to look as hard as we need to. And we were able to. And again, those are commercials that are performed and are performing right now extraordinarily well.
And then Rebecca Roussel from Current said they do have training on accessible communication, so reach out to her. I think there's a couple Current people on here. They really are fantastic folks. Current, I bet as far as an agency, they live and breathe it, so we're big fans of theirs. Let me see, Paul. I think we're winding down. Okay, so maybe we'll do one more question and then move it on. All right. So 1 out of 4 American adults self-identify with some type of disability, which we discussed. Given that, what is the biggest challenge that prevented brand marketers realize that there is a great opportunity to join the inclusivity movement in this way? And what is the easiest way to win people over on why they should?
As far as why branders and marketers or communicators should?
Yeah, I think it's like, what has been the biggest challenge why people aren't taking advantage of this as a piece of inclusivity? And then what's the easiest way to convince people why they should?
So as far as why they're not, I'll go back to me prior to my CEO making this a focus for us. It was just not something that was front and center for me. And I know subsequently when I would mention this to other people, people that Tina and I know that are really well respected, that are, icons in our profession. You mention this and some people get it and some people don't because they haven't had that exposure. So I think part of it is making that understanding, saying, look, here's the numbers. It's 1 in 4. And if you're not actively including, you're passively excluding. And that's a problem. But then if I go one step farther, let's just say, why would I do this? Because I want to be employed. I want to keep my job so my wife and my children are happy. So if you tell me that I can do something with my advertising and it's going to make it more effective, it's going to drive higher likability, interest in doing business, greater brand awareness, I'd be silly not to do it. So that's why I mentioned earlier, we're giving you the answers to the test. This will resonate with all of your audiences.
Absolutely. That's a great summary. So I wanted to thank Paul and the Voya team, Carrie, Eric, they're all great over there, the Voya team to work with. So thank you all there. And I wanted to thank the IPR team, who's always so good on chat and promoting this, and they're fantastic. So thanks for running that webinar. This, as we said before, this will be recorded and we will we'll send this out. We will also send out the resources with it that were discussed today. And stay tuned for more IPR webinars coming up in the future. And this report will be out next week. So pay attention to it then. And if anyone needs anything or has any questions or wants to talk about the findings, happy to. So please reach out to us and hope you all have a wonderful day and look forward to hopefully seeing you soon.
Thank you.